So thanks again for having me today. My presentation will have four main parts. The first one is a brief introduction about our organization, about ISO, who we are, what we do. Then a quick analysis on the global impact of COVID-19. Then I would like to review the role of international standards in this context, and actually I invite you to come back together so we can build better. And finally, I would like to give a quick overview of the next ISO strategy. So let's start with ISO, and this is us, what you see on the screen. We were created in the year 1946 in London, precisely, right after World War II, because already at that time was very well understood that if we wanted to rebuild the world, we needed international standards. And we started with 25 countries only, so we didn't have the level of diversity we have today, but we did have a very powerful mandate because we knew that we needed international standards to contribute to economic and social development. We knew we needed international standards to protect our people, to protect the planet as well. And we also knew we needed international standards to do things better, to improve management in general. And this is us today. We have seen a big evolution here. It's not 25 anymore, it's 165 members. This picture was taken in Geneva precisely a couple of years ago. And we can see a lot of diversity, colors, regions, people coming from developing and developed countries. So it's a truly global organization. But we keep evolving. This happened on the 24th of September, our very first fully virtual General Assembly. And we can see on the screen Eddie Joroge, the ISO president, participating from Kenya. I know he also participated in this conference last year, which is great. And the mandate, even though we have evolved a lot, the mandate is, I think, stronger than ever. We still need international standards for economic and social development to protect our people and the planet and to support management. So when we think about ISO, many people would tell you, well, it's an international organization in Geneva, building in Geneva. The truth is ISO is a lot more. ISO is a system which is composed of three main pillars. Of course, we start with the Central Secretariat, which exists to support and coordinate the system. But we have our technical committees, in total around 800 technical committees and subcommittees that put together a network, a fantastic network of over 50,000 experts appointed by the members. And we manage a portfolio of over 22,000 international standards. So maybe it would be very easy to create our standards from Geneva in our office, inviting 2-3 experts. That's not the way we like to do things. We conduct an inclusive exercise, inviting experts from all around the world, and that's the way we create our standards. And the third key component, of course, is our members, as I said before, 165 countries, with a very important role, because if you say ISO is in Geneva only, the answer is no. ISO is in the UK as well, and BSI is our member in the UK, and BSI is ISO in the UK. And you also have the members, the power to initiate and approve new standards, to appoint the experts, and to really drive the organization. Because I'm very proud to say this is a member-driven organization, and we have created the infrastructure that would allow the members to actually drive this organization. And you can see on the screen the structure and governance of ISO. I will definitely not go through the details of our organizational structure, but there is one point that I would like to emphasize together with you. There is only one country in the world that is represented in each and every one of this governance structure, and that is BSI. So this is the moment for me to express my heartfelt appreciation and recognition to BSI for your strong commitment towards international standardization and for your huge contribution to ISO. So thank you for that. And that brings me to the second part of my presentation, which is about the global impact of COVID. Because, well, this crisis is truly global and nobody has been spared. But of course, it hit harder in the most vulnerable people and countries. And this crisis has highlighted how vulnerable we are and how fragile our planet is, including us who live here. Um, and this is a lot more than a health issue. It has huge economic and social implications. But of course, if we're going to talk about COVID, we need to start with the health implications. And this is a screenshot from yesterday, the WHO webpage, and we can see that over 55 million cases, over 1.3 million people died that we know of. Of course, the real number is much bigger. There are some good news. Vaccine has been discovered with a very high rate of effectiveness. That is great, but it's still a lot to be seen about how this will actually improve the situation worldwide. The second key impact is about the economy. And this impact is, of course, very significant. This is the biggest crisis of this century and one of the biggest economic crises of the world history, of course. You can see on the screen the global economic outlook of the IMF. This is the October report that predicts a reduction of 4.4 in the global economy. And I'm going to read exactly what they project, because if you look at the year 21, looks very promising, 5.2. However, they say this will be a long and difficult ascent. So the improvement that is projected there is not at all something that we can give for granted. There are still many uncertainties, and the disruption causing this reduction in the global economy go way beyond COVID. Has a lot to do also with some political instability all around the world. Then trade needs to be analyzed in this context. Trade is something very close to my heart and very much related to international standards as well. And this is the latest WTO forecast that was released in October. And it is projected a reduction of 9.2% in the global volume of trade. The good news is that this is better than which was projected in April. And WTO said that there would be a reduction between 13 and 35%. It's been lower than that, 9.2. But again, a lot of uncertainties, because I'm reading again, there is an unusually high degree of uncertainty according to the WTO. And the improvement that is projected for next year, once again, is not something that we can give for granted. And once again, this is not only about COVID. We have seen the international trading system as such under a lot of pressure in the last few years. Actually, one of the key pillars of the WTO is the dispute settlement mechanism. And today, as we speak, there is no capacity to have a full dispute settlement mechanism in place, because the appeal body now is not operational because there is one country that has been blocking the appointment of new judges. And in addition, the organization is in the middle of a process of appointing a new director general, because Roberto Acevedo stepped down a few months ago, even before the end of his term. The good news here is that in the final, we have 2 women. So the next DG of WTO will be a woman, but a big challenges for her. The third dimension of the global context is the SDG, our agenda for the year 2030. And this is by far the most important global agenda, because it represents the consensus of 200 countries about what we need to do in order to improve the situation in our planet and to improve the life quality of 6 billion people. Even before COVID, the assessment from Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, was that if we keep working at this speed, by the year 2030, we will not be able to implement more than 50% of the SDGs. And that gives us a very strong sense of urgency. We need to act now. We need to do things differently if we want to be successful in our commitments. But after that, COVID came, and this is a report produced by the OECD that was released only a few days ago. It's Global Outlook on Financing for Sustainable Development. Because the truth is that the implementation of the SDGs is not only about political will, it is also about financing the implementation of the SDGs, mainly in developing countries. And we can see that before COVID, the gap to implement the SDGs, the financing gap to implement the SDGs was 2.5 trillion. And after COVID, that gap has increased significantly to 4.2 trillion. This is the so-called scissor effect on the SDGs financing. So we know that the situation, the global context is very challenging, it's difficult. And that brings me to the third part of my presentation, which is the role of international standards in this context. Because I believe that international standards are absolutely key to dealing with these challenges, because what the world needs is globally relevant solutions by consensus to respond to global challenges. Those three elements: globally relevant, by consensus to respond to global challenges. So let's go back together to see how we can build better in this context. And there are three elements that I wanted to highlight together with you. First, clearly, there has been a lack of global response. And this is something that was highlighted by the ISO president, Eddie George, in our General Assembly in September. We have seen a lot of great and powerful but individual responses by countries and also by international organizations. And the truth is that what the world needs is coordination and cooperation. It is of the essence, because COVID recognizes no borders here. And the real problem we have, and as I like to say, is that everybody likes coordination, but nobody likes being coordinated. So this is very much about leadership. We need leaders, but also very much about generosity. It's about understanding that the solution is much more bigger and important than my individual mandate or my individual powers. We need to combine our talents. We need to work together. There are great examples in the area of international standardization where cooperation is at the very heart of our system. I just wanted to provide you with one example of the World Standard Cooperation. It's composed of the IEC, ITUT, and also ISO. And we just organized an event together with our members in Saudi Arabia under the umbrella of the G20, where we all together made a call for all the countries composing the G20 to use international standards as a key instrument for digital transformation. So those are the kind of messages that we need to work together so we can be more impactful. So that's number one, lack of global response. The second one is lack of preparedness, because the healthcare system, the global supply chain, even the technology were not well prepared for a crisis of this magnitude. And in the case of technology, we're using Zoom today. You might remember that at the beginning of the crisis, there were huge concerns about security. Now, all of that has been well improved. But the point that I want to make here is that nobody was fully prepared, and we had to make a huge effort to adapt, to be agile, and to respond. So for the next time, and believe me, there will be a next time, probably around climate change or who knows, we better be well prepared. And ISO provides wonderful international standard that can help everybody, companies, organizations, countries, to be better prepared. In terms of risk management, we can identify the risk we have and also identify mitigation countermeasures. Then in terms of business continuity, we should know in advance what are the core key services that we need to secure in order for our organization to survive. And third is resilience. This is not only about bringing things at the point they were before the crisis. This is about learning together. This is about getting stronger. So we use this crisis as a real opportunity. And the third reflection in this context is the need to combine short-term responses or short-term solutions, survival solutions if you wish, with a long-term strategy. And here is when we build back better. So let me present the short-term solutions that we have provided in the ISO family. And we started with moving all our technical committee meetings as virtual meetings. And we did that overnight in March, very early in the process, even before the WHO qualified this crisis as a pandemic. In the year 2019, we conducted 25% of our technical meetings virtually. And we were very, very proud of that, 25% of our meetings virtually. Well, in 2020, overnight, this became 100% of our meetings, which is very challenging, but at the same time, a fantastic opportunity, like in a huge lab where we can experiment together, where we can learn together. That's the opportunity that we have, and I think that we have delivered in this context, and I'm very proud of that. The second one is to provide the right tools. This is not only about Zoom, it's also about additional IT tools such as the online collaborative authoring tool, and also guidance, because conducted meetings virtually, it's very different from face-to-face meetings, and especially when it comes to something which is at the very heart of our system, which is consensus building. So we have provided further guidance to our technical community for them to be effective when it comes to building consensus. And the third one is key standards have been made freely available for the users, for the stakeholders to benefit from those key ISO standards in those areas related to risk management or PPE, personal protective equipment, or even respirators, where we coordinated with our colleagues and friends from the IEC to provide a sort of a package of standards related to respirators so they could benefit from that. But in this context, we have also learned very valuable lessons that I wanted to share with you today. We were quite concerned at the beginning whether there would be an impact in the level of participation of our experts in this fully virtual environment. And what we have learned is that there's been an increase in the level of participation, especially from developing countries. The second lesson here is the need to have a sort of fast track mechanism when we identify that there is an urgent need, a crisis, a situation where we need to produce a standard in, let's say, not months, but weeks. We need to create that sort of fast track mechanism. And there is something that is going to be in the agenda of next year in the context of the implementation of our next strategy. But the third element here, the third key lesson is the need of strong leadership. And I wanted once again to recognize BSI here, because you are the secretariat of our technical committee on occupational health and safety, and you have managed to produce in record time a new deliverable on safe working conditions during a pandemic. And that reflects passion, drive, commitment, a lot of very important qualifications that we need to have if we want to be effective in this context. The second key element of our short-term response has been communication. Communication is of the essence if we want to be effective. We conducted a calling campaign to each and every one of our members. We managed to reach out them individually to identify and to understand their needs so we could be more responsive in this context. Surprisingly, one of the key needs that were identified were not related to technology or resources or capacity building. The key needs were related to exchange of information and sharing experiences, how they had responded to this crisis so they could learn from each other. That was really interesting. And the third element is to work very closely with our stakeholders and users. We need to understand, once again, their needs so we can be more responsive. So we had produced very good short-term responses, I believe, and I'm very proud of that. But this is not about survival. This is about learning together. This is about improving. This is about getting better and stronger. And that is our ISO strategy 2030, and is the way we want to build back better. So in this strategy, the first thing was to develop together, was a long process over a year, very inclusive with over 100 countries participating here. But the first thing we decided was to define the methodology. And we used the so-called Golden Circle methodology that was created by a British author, precisely, Simon Sinek. And he invited us to start with the why. Many times when we define our vision, we start with the what. It's the easy one. Well, we create international standards, or we produce cell phones, we produce, I don't know, whatever. But that is not the essence, that is not the core. So then we can move from the what to the how, what make us different. Well, we work by consensus in a transparent manner, in an inclusive manner, that's all great. But what really gives us the energy, the energy to wake up in the morning and a sense of purpose is the why. And bearing that question in mind, the why, we came up with this vision, making lives easier, better, and safer. And as you can see, is human-centric. We put the people at the very heart of that strategy. Of course, we have three key goals here. ISO standards used everywhere. We can produce very beautiful standards, impeccable from a technical point of view, but if they are not used, we are not relevant. Then meeting global needs. We are and we want to be a global organization. It's not about the needs of a small group of countries, it's about global needs. It's also about all voices heard. We are and we want to be inclusive. Once again, a big recognition to Scott Stidman, our VP, Vice President, Policy and Strategy. You have driven this process, and I'm very happy, very proud of the new strategy that will be implemented starting on the 1st of January next year. Three key elements that I wanted to highlight now in the context of our strategy. First, it's fully aligned with the SDGs. Even in the dates, because this is our strategy 2030, and this is the Global Agenda 2030 as well. Second, we want to be very effective in our support to developing countries, and that's why we have an action plan for developing countries which complements the strategy. When we talk about support to developing countries, it's not about charity. It's not that we are the good people trying to help those who need more assistance. This is about effectiveness. This is a very strategic concept. When we want to support our members and from developing countries, What we want to do is to make ISO a much more stronger and effective international organization. We will only be effective and strong if our members are also strong. And the third one is diversity and inclusion. And ISO has signed the UNECE Declaration on Gender Responsiveness. This is not about developing gender neutral standards. This is about developing a gender responsive standard. And we have also approved our own ISO Gender Action Plan in September last year. This is indispensable if we want to achieve our objective of meeting global needs. And this is my last message for you, my last slide. You can be a standard taker, and that is great, because if you use international standards, you will have global relevance, you will have access to international markets. But I don't think that is good enough. You can be more than a standard taker, you can be a standard maker. And that's why we need your voice. We need your participation, your active participation in international technical committees through BSI. So that is the invitation with which I wanted to finalize my presentation. BSI is already a wonderful leader with the secretariat of many technical committees, but there is always the capacity to have an even stronger participation in our technical activities. Thank you very much.
Sergio, thank you so much for that. Thank you for those thoughts and some of the key messages in there. It feels a little gloomy, some of the figures that we're seeing right now about trade and about the impact of COVID. So some real challenges there. Just before we come to your presentation, we will shortly open up the panel discussion. So if you have some questions for Sergio or for our other panelists, please put them into the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and we'll start taking some of those questions. But maybe I could just have a go first, Sergio, and just ask about whether you think the pandemic is in any way strengthening ISO, whether you think that ISO, because of its, you talked about the need for a global response to the challenges of the pandemic. Do you see ISO coming out of this stronger?
The answer is yes. I think we have managed not only to survive this emergency. If you look at the numbers, we have been very effective in delivering our international standard. All our technical committees are working. The level of participation has increased, and we have published a very similar number of standards compared to the previous year. So that's all fine. But all in all, I think the level of visibility of the importance of international standards is even better now. And that is a huge opportunity for us. And that's what I think the organization is even stronger now.
And the other topic that is taking up a lot of our time, as well as the challenges around EU exit and COVID, is of course the search towards net zero. And we're very proud that next year in the UK we'll be hosting the COP26, the UN Committee on Climate Change, the second most important event in the UK next year after the ISO Week.
I agree.
In London next year, if anyone hasn't got that in their diary. Where do you see ISO's role there to support the UN COP26 agenda and the mitigation against climate change?
Well, we had an interesting conversation this morning with Scott and his team about how we can be very impactful in our participation in the COP26. I truly believe that international standards are indispensable if we want to be effective in the implementation of whatever agreement they manage to reach. I hope the COP26 will be great in terms of achieving good level of consensus and good agreements. But then if we want to make it happen in reality, we need international standards. So we want to have a strong voice there at the highest possible level in the main meeting. We also want to organize a side event there, and we have already started working on that.
Fantastic. And Scott, maybe just a quick word on the ISO strategy. Obviously, you've been heavily involved in your role chairing the strategy group. It's done now, or at least it's the starting line has been reached, and next year will be important. So, do you want to make a few comments on the strategy? Oh, sorry, we still got you on mute there.
Thank you, David. Yes, and thank you, Sergio, for an inspiring presentation, and thank you for your kind words too about BSI and the BSI team. We really appreciate you taking time today to join this event, and one day we'll get you in the room physically with us wherever we hold it in future. But certainly that's going to be next year in London, as we've been talking. So thank you first of all for all that. David, yes, I mean, Sergio's covered in a sense the concept and vision of the strategy, the mission and vision of the strategy, which has been agreed, and that's all been dusted down. And now the question is about implementation and rollout. So what we've been working on, and particularly with the ISO Council Standing Committee on Strategy and Policy, what we call CSCSP, another standards acronym, which is a group of council members from ISO. They've been working tirelessly and over the last 6 months to help shape the implementation plan and what we call the measurement framework, because we're very keen that we should do much more to really understand the value of standards and the role they play in different economies, different cultures, different geographies around the world, in developing and developed countries, and north and south and east and west. So to do that, we need to have a measurement framework that will allow us to track in a rolling way how the value of what we do, our standards makers do, how it's taken up and used in practice. And I'm a big believer in proxies, actually. I'm a big believer in thinking in a fresh, new way about how standards are used, how they're consumed, as Shirley, our colleague Shirley would say, to derive benefit. So, for example, if one standard delivers improvement in productivity, it's not the fact that it's one standard, it's the measure of productivity improvement that's the outcome. So I think the measurement framework is really important, and we're refining that now. We're also carrying forward some really interesting and important projects, particularly around digitalization, and we'll be launching new projects that are going to involve the member countries who will help the ISO-CS in Geneva, to Central Secretariat in Geneva, to drive these projects forward. But we certainly see digitalization being a huge change over the next number of years. So that's an important element. So the elements that we're coming together, David, in the next month, actually, prior to going public next year, will be the rolling implementation plan, which will be all the projects that we're driving forward, the measurement framework that will allow us to track our progress and adapt and adjust to the years ahead, and the communications package that we want to ensure brings this exciting news both to the members, to the standards users community, and to the world at large. And we'll see that starting with the members early in the new year, and then we'll see more about that at the ISO GA in London in September 2021. So it's an exciting time, and it's really about, for me, making sure that we are aligned with the purpose, the vision, the sustainable development goals, the aspirations that governments have, that industry has in particular, and that consumers have for a better, safer world ahead. We have to tuck in with that and support and accelerate that program of work.
Now, of course, at the heart of what ISO does is standards development, and BSI has recently brought in a new standards development director. I want to bring Neil Musk into the conversation. Hi, Neil.
Hi, David.
It's a little unfair, as you've only been here a few months since you started, but maybe you could just reflect on what you've heard from Sergio. They talked about the new work that we've done around the pandemic and the speed of that. So what does better look like for you? We're talking about building back better and the role of standards. What does building back better look like in terms of how we develop standards?
Well, thanks, David. It's a great question. And I think Sergio sort of very eloquently described the strategic challenges in front of us. I think sort of thinking a bit more about the day-to-day, how we make it happen, I suppose I would highlight 3 challenges. Firstly, how we maximize the range of views that we want to engage with standard development. Secondly, how we make sure that the way we're developing standards makes it as easy as possible to incorporate those views in the standard development process. And then thirdly, as Scott was referencing, actually making it easy to use the standards at the end of the day, because ultimately we want that needs to happen to make the impact happen. And maybe just to expand on each of those, I mean, I want to stress we have 13,500 amazing people who are working incredibly hard every day to make wonderful standards that make a huge difference. But I think talking to them, what I hear is actually they realize that the real value and legitimacy of the standards comes from having the right answer, and that the right answer comes from incorporating as many views as possible. So I think from an individual point of view, that's making sure that we've got the maximum diversity of backgrounds, but also, regions, which some of the COVID technology that was talking about has enabled, and also that we're making sure we're getting the new generation of standards makers coming through. And then from an organizational side, that's a little bit about making sure that we've got a full range of organizations, including, for example, SMEs on the one hand and global organizations on the other, making sure that they're inputting into the standards making process, that we're making, getting full representation from new themes and new industries like technology in the standards making process, and also that we're sort of really then bringing that together in an effective way, both nationally and internationally. So that's the first theme. I think on the second theme around how we make the standard making process easier, I think we're all working on ways to both transform the technology, but also critically the process, just to make it easier and more effective for our volunteers to think about how to incorporate all those wonderful diversity of views into the actual process, because traditionally that's been quite a manual process and quite laborious and hard for the best intent to bring everything together. But there are ways that the technology and process can help that. And then thirdly, on the use of standards, as Scott was referencing, I think we've traditionally tended to create a sort of physical document that is the standard that's quite wordy. But actually, when we look at the way that our users are using the standards, we realize there's a big diversity of ways that they use it. And actually, we need to think about how we can make it easier for them to get the real value from those standards, whether it's working out how we can incorporate their value chain better, whether it's thinking about new technology such as machine readable or interpretable standards. They're the opportunities in front of us. But I think there's such an opportunity there for a need from both the global and national perspective to bring that together. It's a really exciting opportunity.
Well said, Neil. So maybe we'll just pick up those questions about diversity. And again, if anybody has any questions, do please put them in the Q&A and we'll pick them up here and we'll try and answer as many of them as we can live. Interesting question that's coming from Tim King is about the use of the English language. Now, he says in his question that he's recently read that some scientists are worried that working largely in the English language creates cultural bias and limits diversity in scientific research. And is there a risk the same problem occurs when developing ISO standards? So how can ISO ensure diversity, even when developing standards with groups of experts who can only communicate in one or two common languages? Now, that's a real challenge for ISO, and maybe working remotely, is it easier? Is it harder? It's difficult to say. But Sergio, do you want to pick that up?
Yes, it's a wonderful question and a very difficult one as well, because if we believe in diversity and inclusiveness, language can be a barrier, and we know that. Working in English is very practical, and it's the solution we have at hand today. So it's great, but we need to be aware that there is a cost in terms of participation and inclusiveness. Let me give you one example. In developing countries, and myself, I come from Chile. The thing is that it's already difficult to find the right experts to participate in technical domains. And not that you don't have experts, but that they are not everywhere. So you need to find the right expert. And the second challenge is to ensure that that person is also able to communicate in English. So it's a sort of a double barrier in that. And the other element here is that one thing is attending a meeting, and a very different thing is to have an effective participation in that meeting. So in that regard, and this is my opinion, the COVID situation has been great in terms of allowing more people to connect. But in terms of an effective participation, I do have my doubts. So this is something to be analyzed much more in detail. Because when it comes to a face-to-face meeting, you have body language, you have something which is fantastic, the coffee break. We have seen when it comes to building consensus, many times you can reach that consensus during the coffee break or in a dinner at night. So I have mixed opinions.
Yeah, Scott, do you want to come in on that one? We know there's a real challenge, isn't there?
I have mixed feelings too, and I think that being aware of the problem is half the battle. I've often reflected on the privilege I have of being a native English speaker in chairing meetings or participating in meetings, and I mean, I'm sure I could improve, but I do try hard, and I think that some native English speakers, particularly, I'm going to say particularly British, actually, they do tend to speak very fast and make it very difficult and complicated grammar and so on. And I think we've got to really be very, very good at trying to support inclusivity in our work. But I don't think it's just a language issue. I mean, there are all sorts of cultural issues around participation in discussions and meetings, even face to face. I mean, and certainly virtually, which inhibit people and or advantage people depending on their behaviours. So this applies to native English speakers and to others. They can be bullies, or they can be quiet, keep silent. And so it's very hard. And I think there's a lot of the skill here is around the chairing and the management of the committees. And we need to do more to train chairs and to support committee managers. Language, I think, and Sally was making a comment in the chat there about TC 283. We may be able to get over that problem, but active participation requires cultural understanding and insight as well. So that's a really big barrier. I think we're going to be faced up with quite a serious challenge quite soon around the effectiveness of hybrid meetings. We've participated 100% virtually, and so you might say that's level playing field. I'm not sure it is, but partly for time zone reasons, apart from anything else. The Pacific is a very big ocean. There's no doubt about that. Sergio would know about it. So in terms of time zones and minimizing impact, it's very hard to shift away from the early morning in the Americas, late evening in Asia, if you want to get everybody on the call the same day. But as we move into next year, and we undoubtedly will have travel corridors and hopefully vaccines and so on, but some will be able to travel to Geneva or anywhere, and some will not. And so there will be a demand for hybrid meetings, and certainly we've had demand for virtual participation in the ISOGA, for example. So there's a difference between streaming and observing something and participating. That's two different things altogether. So we can stream an event like today, but to participate in an event is a whole different game. And then how do you balance the participation virtually with the people physically in the room? That is really difficult. But we know, and we were on a call with Osvaldo from Argentina just the other day, and he's been very strong proponent about the opportunity that's presented by virtual participation. So we have to square this circle, encouraging virtual participation as a means of maybe developing skills and participating, but in the end, you've got to be in a room. That said, Neil, to your point, and to Sergio's introduction, we will very soon have standards that write themselves. We will have standards that you can't read. They'll be in code. The actual document, or if there's a document, the code will be code. And there may be a human readable form, but it will be code within some few years. So we're going to have to keep, there's a moving target, David. It's a moving target, but we always got to do better. We've got to be more open and more inclusive. And I've learned a lot about that from our wonderful team this year and recent years already. And we're going to make very deliberate moves in BSI to address this diversity and inclusivity.
It's very important. Neil, do you want to come in there?
And David, I was just going to say, I think the challenges have been really well articulated there by Scott and Sergio. But it always, to strike a note of optimism, it always the opportunities that it created through these new mechanisms. I think we've really seen through this year, having expected it would be a very difficult process. I've had quite a few of the chair people say to me, actually, the the sort of rigor of using Teams has meant that people actually have increased their participation. It's easier for people who would otherwise be quiet to come in, or that can create the challenge around spontaneity. But the thing they really stress is actually the opportunity the technology may be our friend over the next few years. So we're already getting sort of the ability to create transcripts through, for example, Teams. It won't be long, we think, before we'll be able to do potentially simultaneous translation, or and obviously translation of documentation has become a lot easier through more freely available translation techniques. So just to strike a note of optimism, there may be tools that will help us in this as well as challenges.
So getting that diverse participation that you call for, Sergio, in your presentation, there's a question that's come in from Peter Hebert. Now, we've been looking at getting young engineers and young professionals more generally more involved in the standards development process. So I might just ask Neil and you, Sergio, just to think about, just to give us your views on what progress we can make on that area. Peter reminds us that the picture that was taken in 1946 was outside the Institution of Civil Engineers, a venue that we'll be using next year as well for the ISO week. And indeed the building next door was where BSI was formed. But in fact, engineers are not necessarily able to fully participate, or perhaps that some of their voices are not always recognised. So there's a few questions from Peter about how do you recognise expertise from the professional community. But I just want to extend that out and have a think about what more we can do to get the next generation into our work. Neil, do you want to just pick up from BSI perspective firstly?
Yeah, I guess two things I'd emphasize. One is we're very actively working around trying to extend our proactivity around this. So rather than just relying on, which has been a great store of our success, relying on people's knowledge and networks to create other members and drawing from our traditional group of members, we're also proactively trying to communicate to groups of those areas that we're underrepresented in, and it could be any type, it could be background, it could be region, etc. And I think the advance of social media and other things gives us the tools to do that much more effectively than we might have done in the past. So we're really making huge efforts around that and focusing our efforts next year, which we hope will have a huge impact. The second thing I'd say is, having come from industries, and I was from investment banking and education, that not great traditional users of standards, I would stress the ignorance of standards in some industries and amongst some younger communities, that actually we have a responsibility to get out there and explain what we do in an even more effective way than we do now. Because I think, ironically, they all use standards effectively, they just don't call them that. So we've got to make it, competing with all the other things that are going on in everyone's lives as lives get busier, it's imperative that we make sure that people understand the value of what we're doing and the enjoyment and fulfillment they can get from being part of it.
Mm-hmm. Sergio, from an ISO perspective, how do you see the challenge?
Well, we have a very clear approach here, is that we trust our members. And it could be very easy for us to say, I need a new standard, so I bring a couple of top consultants to my office in Geneva, and we do it, in 4 square walls. And it could be very effective if you wish, but it's not what we want, it's not what we believe in. So we have delegated through the national delegation principle that power to our members, for you to pick what you consider are the right and appropriate experts. 2 additional comments. Number 1, it's really important that those experts not only know that subject matter, but they're hopefully close to the management of the company they are working in. Because sometimes, you have those experts that don't really understand what is the strategy of that specific company, or they are like very, very far away from the decision-making process. So I think our responsibility is also to promote the importance of participation and to convince CEOs that they need to appoint their best people to fulfill that role, not an expert that is forgotten somewhere for years and years. And the second one is about age. And I fully agree that if we want to be sustainable as an organization, we need to engage with younger experts and with the next generation. Right now, under the leadership of Scott in his capacity of VP policy at ISO, we're collecting experiences in our members and also in other organizations. We know that the IEC has a very successful young professional program, And we want to create our own initiative and taking into account those national experiences. And that will be included in the rolling implementation plan for our next strategy.
Great, important area. Scott.
Yes, David, I'd love to comment on that, not least because I'm a fellow of the Institution of Civil Engineers and know that building well and have done for a long time. So I think that actually there are lessons that we can learn of the work we do in the IEC, for example. The Young Professionals program is really very exciting and very innovative. My ambition would be to extend that concept of the Young Professionals program to cover all sectors and lift it out of electrotechnical and electronic systems and into all sectors as a concept of attracting another generation. But really it needs scale up. I mean, the critical thing about young professionals, it needs to be scaled. And we've seen some very successful young professional events that we've held at BSI, I've hosted in the last few years, pre-COVID, where we took a thematic approach, an issue-based. So rather than organizing a meeting saying, wouldn't you like to be on a standards committee, we organized a meeting about, I don't know, artificial intelligence and targeted it at a younger audience through the right media channels and attracted a very interesting group of super young people, younger people. So I think that there are actually practical things, Neil, that we can do to build on it when we get back into the swing of it. Specifically on the engineering side, because your question was about engineers, and that's a really interesting one, and Sergio has touched on it. And I think that the UK, and I'm speaking as a engineer by background, has a particular problem here, that the education of engineers in the UK about the role of standards is particularly narrow. I'm not going to say non-existent, because engineers are taught about standards, but they're taught about them as some kind of checkbox, tick box compliance thing. And if you're a successful engineer, you don't need standards, because that's how it's taught these days. So we have to get away from that, and we have to start looking at the engineering education in our universities and postgraduate courses to teach the role of standards as a consensus tool of best practice. So of course, you can do what you like, you're a very clever engineer, but actually in terms of consensus of what's good practice to enable you, your entrepreneurial idea, your company, your innovation to be successful, you need a consensus. Otherwise, you're not going to reach your users, your clients, your manufacturers, your supply chain. So to teach standards as an enabler for engineers rather than as a tick box that you come to after you've done everything else would be a bit of a breakthrough in British engineering culture, I think. And I think we don't make it any easier for ourselves, actually. I know we've given some fantastic awards today, and we refer to our wonderful standards makers as experts, and they are experts. But sometimes the word expert to a young person is quite daunting, and it's not necessarily true that we need the most academic experts on our standards committees. We need real people on our committees, and younger people bring a perception of life and their experience and what they want that is just as valuable as a technical guru. So I think we've got to be cautious about the language we use if we want to make it an attractive proposition, and ultimately build the concept of standards into continuing professional development, so what we call CPD. So to try and see the professional engineering institutions in the UK promoting the role of standards as a genuine part of your continuing professional development, your career path. I'm sure that our friends in Germany working on standards is quite normal in German industry, but it is not normal in British industry. So we do have a cultural divide there, which is very old, and I would like to tackle it personally if I could. So that's a great question for that. But fundamentally, if we began to evolve the idea of standards in the UK from being tick box to being a consensus tool for the future, I think that's a much more attractive proposition, and it's absolutely true. And Sergio, you've talked about the concept that ISO within 5-10 years actually may be known, maybe more maybe better recognized for its work in bringing consensus than bringing standards. Standards is maybe the output, consensus is the outcome, or something like that. So if we began to think of BSI and ISO as a consensus tool, then again, this might be a much more attractive proposition to the next generation.
So just a reminder for everyone on the call that questions should be in the Q&A box. So we've got a lot of ISO committee chairs on the call, as well as participants in ISO committees. So do put your questions in there, and we'll try and get through as many as we can. Another group that's hard to reach are consumers. And next year we celebrate 70 years since we established what's now the BSI Consumer Forum. It's also been Consumer International's 60th anniversary this year, and Sadie Dainton, who leads our consumer work and is the vice chair of ISO's Consumer Policy Committee, Capolco, asks the question that you would ask, of course, which is how important does ISO think it is to ensure consumers from around the world are fully engaged in ISO standards? And I know it's not always been possible to really reach out to consumers in every country. Sergio, would you like to take that one?
Yeah. First of all, I think in terms of diversity and inclusivity, consumers have an indispensable role for us to be effective in terms of creating truly good quality international standards, number one. Second, well, I'm very proud to have participated in the 60th anniversary of Consumer International only a few days ago, when I had the opportunity to present the ISO view in front of around 200 organizations, consumer organizations from over 100 countries in the world. And this is not only about saying this is important, this is about creating the infrastructure to make sure that consumers can participate. And that's why we have a consumer policy committee at ISO, which not only leads our efforts in this area, it is also a member of our board, our council board. So all the strategic decisions in our organization, well, consumers have a voice. It's not only about standard development, it's also about the governance of our organization. And second, I see big challenges at the national level in this area. I'm sure you understand this very well, especially in developing countries. It's very difficult for consumers to organize themselves and also to find the necessary resources for them to have a voice, an effective voice, and to participate. And for them to find also the resources with the level of independence that is required. But it is not only about consumers that have been founded for a group of interests. You need consumers that have an independent voice when it comes to protecting their interests.
Absolutely. Scott, anything else to add on that, and the role of consumers? Certainly in the UK, we found consumers have added so much to our committees over such a long time, but bringing them in is a real challenge.
Yeah, it is. And I think our Consumer and Public Interest Network is doing incredible work. And our Consumer Public Interest Strategic Advisory Committee, CPI-SAC, also. So my thanks to them. But we train our consumer representatives. You can't really just take people off the street, although real life experience is important. So how we can bring more of that public voice in, I'm not yet sure. I mean, I think perhaps part of the solution here is to build another circle of our community, and we're trying to do that through our digital communities, where we can try and attract 10 or 100 times the number of people who are following us, if that's the right social media term, following what's trending in BSI, and so try and bridge that gap. And from a much greater pool of people who are participating, listening, reading, chatting, communicating, a community of people, we may be able to draw standards makers of the future. And that may be a way also to harvest a better understanding of public opinion, consumer voice, and so on. But in a world where diversity is so overdue in so many ways, the voice of the consumer is truly fundamental. And of course, also the voice of the consumer is very close to the voice of the SME. We know that the SME and micro enterprise tend to be very similar views to consumers. So we need to tackle both of those. Yeah.
We've had a question from Charles Campbell, which is more about how audits are carried out during the pandemic. It's a little bit out of scope for what we're talking about here, so we won't deal with it. If you want to know more about remote audits, another BSI website has got information about drone technology and other things that are being deployed.
Yeah, but we could comment just to say that actually that too has been remarkably seamless, from what I understand from assurance colleagues. That has been remarkably seamless, and an awful lot has switched into remote auditing. Whether that's sustainable and whether that's enduring and whether it's relevant and possible in all sectors, but in the circumstances we've been find ourselves in, it has happened, and a huge amount has shifted into a remote environment. So that, combined with other forms of monitoring, I mean, you can see in the digitalization agenda, you can see future opportunities where there may well be remote monitoring, 24/7 monitoring standards that are built into the workflow of companies through apps. That the whole thing starts to take on a more continuous process rather than the traditional auditing of the past on a snapshot basis. So I think there's a lot of innovation happening in that space right now, David.
Mm. Roland Hill, yeah,
David,
please,
I can also
Sergio.
confirm that at the international level, CASCO, Conformity Assessment Committee, has been very busy working to enhance our tools to allow remote audits, which I think is indispensable for us to work in this environment.
Mm-hmm. Lots going on there. So Roland Hill from Landesgear has asked about how does the BSI ISO strategy act to stimulate that trilogy of standards organizations, regulators, and industry consortia interconnecting? I'm sure that consumers are in there as well. How can the strategy work so that we can bring that together more strongly? Scott, do you want to go first from a national perspective?
I think I'll step forward on this one too, because it plays partly to what Sergio was saying earlier, that ISO is a membership organization, and the principle of national delegation is fundamental, and regulation is fundamentally a national activity because it's to do with protecting people and the environment. So in a sense, the responsibility for engaging with regulators will always be first and foremost at a national level, and BSI certainly takes that responsibility extremely seriously. And this morning we had a very interesting session about regulation and the changing landscape in the UK and the internal market bill and Brexit and all this. So you're really seeing actually the rubber hit the road about regulation and standards as a nation of the scale of the UK, which is a substantial economy in the world, is suddenly transitioning to a completely new market regulatory framework and having to learn lessons that it hasn't had to deal with for 30 years. So quite an interesting question. And I think that it falls on BSI not to be simply there pouring the coffee for our wonderful committees, but actually being in government, in the departments, and doing that job. I mean, that I feel very much is my job also, and David, your job as in the policy team. That's what we do all day, is try to just talk to regulators. I mean, in answer to the question, tomorrow morning I'm back on a call with telecoms on telecoms regulation, telecoms security and resilience, and the role of standards in that space. So being in the room with regulators, another example is building safety. We've been talking about the competence standards that we're bringing together, creating new competence standards to support the building safety bill in the UK, to support the competence of the construction profession in parallel with the regulation of key roles in construction. So I think that the test here is the standards body, the member of ISO, fully engaged with regulators in their country or not? Are they just working as some junior part of their government or some publishing company, or are they engaged? And if you look across the spectrum of ISO members, you'll find countries in different categories. Some are very well connected with their governments and regulation activity, and some are less well connected. So I think that's where I would place the first responsibility. It's not easy for ISO in Geneva to engage with regulators, certainly at national level. But that said, there are regulatory recommendations that come from the global level. You know, we could look at global organizations, the UN produces various requirements that are taken forward by national level. So there is an interaction that Sergio may want to comment on, and indeed, Sergio, in your previous role, you might have a comment to make before you came to ISO.
Yes, I was with the World Customs Organization. That is true. I think from the international perspective, and it's not only about the national standard body talking to the regulators. I think this should be a two-way stream, because for countries, when it comes to international trade, they need to make sure that their regulations are in compliance or based on international standards. Otherwise, they could be understood as barriers to trade. So it's a conversation that is interesting for both parties. That is number one. And number two, well, I normally receive a question, because for many countries, standards should be mandatory, not voluntary. And that is very close to the world of regulators. The truth is that most of our work, it's a part of our value proposition is that we create voluntary standards, because in other words, this is an invitation to excellence. And in the slogan of BSI, making excellence a habit, something like that. Well, we believe that international standards are an invitation for excellence. So we are not talking about regulations that are mandatory and fix a minimum acceptable level. For us, that minimum is not good enough. We need to go beyond. The invitation is to be excellent, go beyond that minimum level.
Right. Neil, do you want to come in there? Oh, you just, let's just unmute you first.
Sorry, I was just going to say, having come from two industries that are heavily regulated, but not where standards don't feature very heavily, I was surprised at the sort of seeming gap in many cases between the two. And I think there's a real opportunity, you know, having myself had to sort of deal with a lot of the global regulators after the financial crisis representing banks. You know, we were effectively getting together to create mini standards ourselves without realizing that's what we were creating. So I think just to echo the experience and the potential for us to leverage standards as solutions to regulators by, as Scott says and Sergio said, both at a national and international level, engaging with those regulators more so they realize the potential of what we can offer.
And of course,
I think David, as tempting as it is to say that if you made a standard mandatory, it would help. It won't. I mean, it simply won't, because you immediately switch the standard from being an opportunity to being a burden. And you know what that's like. I mean, wherever that happens, it's a burden. So if you thought of, you lose the value of the vast majority of standards. I mean, of course, regulators need to use industry consumer advice in a consensus format to support the delivery of regulation. But if you regulate a standard, it becomes a law. And that is not our game at all. I mean, you then are removing the tool, the value of standards that can bring, because you're confusing people between what is the law and what is an opportunity. And if you are promoting the idea that consensus is an advantage and excellence is a habit, and you're trying to support that, then you've removed a tool from the regulator as well, because the regulator wants both tools. They want an incentive, a carrot, and they need a stick, the law. But once you make the carrot the stick, you've lost your carrot. So you've got to be very careful about the levers that the regulator can pull to get the results they want. And I think a more sophisticated use of voluntary standards would see us promoting the idea that standards were enablers. They were to support the transformation of industry and consumer protection to a higher level. And the law is the law. Where these interface, we need very careful language. But if you look at old style regulation, old style economies where technical regulation is very prescriptive, and that's a very different game. And it's very difficult to get out of that situation, and very confusing in a world that has become as complex as it has today.
And I think to your point, Scott, what we're seeing actually as we move with Brexit through looking at the harmonised standards in the EU to delegated standards, as Richard was talking about this morning, is the power of those standards that can be used as a sort of presumption of conformity with regulation, as you say, voluntary standards, rather than those mandatory ones. So there's some real potential there, whether we can expand the remit of that.
Yeah.
So Sergio, we might just look at a topic that's pretty hot in the UK right now, which is around trade, international trade and trade deals, and where standards can play a role. You put a lot of information in your slide deck about WTO and their picture of global trade. Where do you see the relationship between ISO and WTO, and what more can we do nationally to support that? And it's a critical relationship for ISO. How do you see standards and trade interplaying?
Well, they do interplay and very closely, actually. And the very concrete example there is the agreement on technical barriers to trade, where there has been a very specific recognition from the WTO that if you want to create new regulations that might be a barrier to trade, the way to do it is by using international standards. So you are guaranteed that you are not imposing illegal tariffs. That's number one. There is a second element here, is that the WTO work by consensus. And I think ISO, at the heart of our system is consensus building and cooperation. And I think we need to raise our voice there. And as was said by Roberto Acevedo, the previous DG, not long ago, that if you believe that international trade is a real engine for economic and social development, speak up. Because silence can be as damaging as any trade war. So we need to speak up, because what we believe here as a solution for the world is consensus and international cooperation. And that, of course, make us good partners with the WTO.
Yeah. Scott, do you want to come in there talking about the relationship that we have with the Department for International Trade in the UK? Obviously, it's a new bit of science in the UK, trade deals, and it's something that we're trying to educate them on.
Yeah, so they've been really fantastic, actually. I mean, our cooperation with the Department of International Trade has gone from strength to strength, and the officials there are very knowledgeable indeed now about the role of standards and the subtle differences. This came to the surface really for me with the building safety bill, which I already mentioned, where it was articulated how there were 4 ways that the government uses the word standards, and you have to understand the subtle distinctions between them. And the first of those is technical regulation. So the obvious one, when countries talk about regulatory standards, that's what they mean. And then the second one is where they are given some legitimacy by a minister or department in some sort of approved document, so some sort of guidance. And then thirdly, our standards, the national standards, British standards, used to support other purposes, but they are based on the formal national representation, consensus, stakeholder engagement, technology agnostic, neutral, and patent-free, that sort of thing. So, and then fourthly, the pure industry standards, including forum consortia and all that important activity as well. So these 4 categories are all part of the lexicon of a trade conversation, and the negotiating teams on both sides, in our case, Department for International Trade, need to be very comfortable with that language and which of these levers can do what, and what is one country asking of the other country, and are they speaking the same language for which they need standards. So yes, we're working very closely with them. I think it's been very exciting, the commitment of UK stakeholder community, but also from International Trade and government towards UK's role in using international standards, and the international standard system has been very, very encouraging.
So Sergio, one of the areas that you highlighted in your report was about the Gender Action Plan that ISO is signing up to. One of the groups that we're proud to have leadership from the UK on is the UNEC Gender Responsive Standards work, and Stephanie Einen, as well as organising this conference, and work in Neil's team, is doing a great job steering that. So Stephanie's asked about whether we see standards and standards development changing in order to drive greater equality, diversity and inclusion in organisations and society. There's lots of great work going on right now, but where do we go next with this? What's the opportunities?
Well, thanks for that question. This topic is very close to my heart personally. It's not an easy one. First of all, because a lot of people do not believe that this is important, as simple as that. And they say, well, we are technical organizations, we should be driven by technical expertise, gender doesn't matter. So first thing we need to do is to raise awareness that this is about effectiveness. Once again, this is not about trying to be nice, this is about trying to be better as an organization, number one. Number two, in our gender action plan, we have set 3 categories of actions. And the first one is to create a baseline so we understand where we are as an international organization. Because if you ask me today, David, what is the breakdown between men and women in our technical community, I would have to give you the worst possible answer. And that is, I don't know. We do not have full visibility about the breakdown between men and women. And there are a lot of good reasons for that. I mean, we can take the easy way and look at the box of Mr., Miss, and so on, but that is not the kind of answer we really want, and that is not consistent with the SDG 5, which is related to gender equality. So there are also important dimensions related to GDPR, or data privacy and data protection, because if we ask too much information, it becomes a sort of a secret, a very protected information that makes our life very, very difficult to manage, actually. So we're in that effort now, collecting data so we can fix that baseline and then measure progress. And we have made some good progress, but not good enough, in my opinion. We have around 8,000 responses from our technical community of a universe of 50,000 international experts. So I think we need more in terms of engagement and response, and we need to count on our members at the national level for this one. I know the BSI in the UK is very active in this area, but for other countries this is not as important as it is for us. Number two, we need to review our standards to make sure that they are gender responsive. And so if we first identify the key standards and then we make that review, we will be making progress. And at the same time, when it comes to new standards, during the standard development process, we need to create a sort of a lens where we can compare those standards which are under development against these principles, so we make sure that the final outcome is gender responsive. And the third one is to create a sort of a inventory or repository of best practice. And for that, we have created a network composed of gender experts, or people working passionate about the gender issue from all our members. And we expect to have their access to good information and also a place where we can have these discussions.
Wow, right. That's great progress. And Neil, the challenge is on us to make the same kind of changes.
Deliver on it, yeah. And I think it comes back to the points we were discussing earlier about the role of the consumer and other communities in making the standard as good as possible by having, and as impactful as possible by having as diverse a set of opinions going into the development of the standard, and then taking into account all the different communities that the standard is going to have an impact on. In terms of the process we're using, we're sort of really trying to focus on all the areas that are underrepresented on 3 things. One, how do we recruit to make sure, how do we attract people from all those diverse communities? And that can be about communication. It can be about showing on your, as simple as on your marketing communication, showing that people that you recognize on the marketing, rather than all being old white men, for example. Then it's about actually the experience when they're working in standards development, that we are accommodating their needs. And that obviously is a range of different things for different people, but it can be, for example, about looking at whether you can devote 2 whole days to a standards conference, or whether there are other ways to engage people. And that's not just about gender, that's all different types of people we need to think about that for. And then third, I think it's about actually making sure that the experience is strong in terms of promotion and selection into senior leadership roles. And I've worked in previous organizations where by making that a process and thinking about the barriers to that progression, they've been able to make huge differences quite quickly. So, for example, ensuring that there's a female on every selection panel, or that you're looking at CVs from a gender neutral perspective, can actually make quite a difference. So there's a number of different techniques I think we need to use to try and make this real.
So a question that's coming from Martin Cottam, who chairs the ISO Committee on Occupational Health and Safety, and he said that the pandemic has led us to find ways to fast-track development of new standards and guidance, challenging the popular perception that standards development is a long and protracted process. Shouldn't we now reset our expectations and aim to make all standards development move faster to reflect the generally faster pace of work and of our lives? So this is a question for all of you. I won't accept the answer yes, because that's taken as read, that yes, we should, but how is the question? So who would like to give us some concrete examples of how we can actually make this system move faster at the pace that we want it to? Neil, you're the new guy. Do you want to go first? And you've seen it as a new person through new eyes.
Look, as a new person who doesn't fully, pretend to understand every nuance, I'm still intrigued by this question and what the right balance, as Scott said earlier on, between the power of those things we've been able to achieve so quickly through COVID, and yet trying to make sure that it comes back to that point about the best possible consensus and the best impact, which I think, as Sergio said, can often take a while, particularly when you get into that global context. So I'm torn, but I lean towards, obviously, having come from industries like banking that are quite fast moving, why can't we move faster, and how can we help people move faster through technology and other things to facilitate that process? And I think given the demands, if we want to be relevant on some of the key themes that face the world, like sustainability, I think it is incumbent on us to try and move faster. Otherwise, we may find ourselves out of that loop, which would be a real shame given the potential of what we could add.
I think we have to recognize that there'll be some people on this call who will be screaming at their laptops that they don't want fast, they want the right standard. So it's not for everybody, this, but Sergio.
Yeah, no, two things. First, faster not always means better. It's faster when needed, but in some standards, you do need the time to make sure that you are responding with the right level of quality. And there is a process that needs to mature, if you wish, to make sure that actually solving the problem or addressing the challenge that we want to. But it is true that in many cases, we do need fast standards. And for that, you need first to review our processes. And this is what we do in the TMB, our Technical Management Board. It is going to review the process next year. And in addition, one of the things that was understood now because of the pandemic is that we lack today a fast-track process in case of urgent needs related to a specific. So we might need a specific process to develop a standard in maybe a couple of weeks, and that would be great. In addition, one thing that we do not want to compromise ever is our core. It's fine. We want to create standards in a faster manner, but we want to make sure that they are built by consensus. I'm not willing to compromise consensus. They are inclusive, they are transparent, we have the right level of representation, including consumers. So those are our core values. That is what we believe in. And so it's not all about fit, it's also about producing the right type of.
Mm-hmm. Scott?
David, I warmly welcome that, and thanks Neil and Sergio for those thoughts. I mean, I would just add that it's not about speed, it's about timeliness. Mm-hmm. So here's a use of the English language carefully. It's about timeliness. And I was telling a story the other day about the time I had to jump off a ship that was traveling at 20 knots across the sea onto another boat. And it's not about how fast you do it, it's about doing it at the right time. So otherwise you fall in the sea. So the problem here is that we need to be timely, so that the consensus outcome is supporting the ambitions of the group who need it. And I mean, we saw the most excellent example already today with the Safe Working Guidelines Flex that Sergio kindly mentioned earlier. So we can do things very rapidly if rapidity is what's required. The critical thing is that we are flexible in the sense of being able to adapt it. So beyond consensus, we might think of dynamic consensus, the concept that, like software, you are willing to iterate and update, provided that community accepts the lower level of stability, because the outcome is immediately timely and valuable for them. So it's not just speed against quality, it's stability that's another dimension to this. And we have a particular situation right now going on as I speak about face coverings and the urgency of having a formal standard for that. And it's very clear that there's a massive public interest. We absolutely have to have a specification that manufacturers can use to improve the quality and effectiveness or efficacy of face coverings that are being used by the general public. And yet, we can't wait months for that. We need it now. And yet our systems kind of lock in a particular cycle, and we need to find ways around that. So I'm all for dynamic consensus. I'm very excited about the Flex process as one tool to address that where it's relevant, but where we have a timely challenge that would benefit from the full process, then we should begin that process, the full process, because it is more inclusive, more diverse, more consensus, more stakeholder based, more chance for public consultation. So the values are heavier, but timeliness is for me what it's all about.
Yeah, and a couple of comments there supporting that, one from the chair of the British Standards Society, our user group, and also from one of our ISO committee chairs, David Smith. We're talking about a range of timescales. Okay, our time is short and we're about to close, but I want to put you each on the spot, if I may, just to finish, because we're coming to the end of 2020, a pretty rotten year for most people, and we're glad to see the end of it. So I want us to go forward 12 months and look back on 2021 and just bring out some of the highlights, some of the things that we really want to see next year in our world, the things that will make us really feel that we've succeeded in our mandate. And so I'm going to start with you, Neil, and then ask Scott, and then give Sergio the final word. But if we could look forward in 12 years' time and look back at 2021, what can this audience hope to have seen that's different, that's new, that's moved the agenda onwards? So shoot, whatever you
said 12 months, David, or 12 years? 12.
It's about timeliness, Scott. 12 months. 12 months.
12 months. Yeah.
So looking back next year, Neil, what do you think we might have been able to do?
I'll highlight two things. I hope one, fingers crossed and medicine permitting, I would hope that we will have had the chance to meet again. I think that is such a crucial part of the standards making process, of the international collaboration that Sergio was stressing the importance of. And whilst we're probably unlikely to go back to the old world, we should take the best of what we've had now with the best of the old. And I think that will be a huge fillip to the whole standard making process. And personally, I hope that we'll have made a big progression on thinking about sustainability and the role of standards within that. So I know there's already been huge work done at the ISO and British level, but I think given the potential of things like COP, we hope to have got another step forward in terms of that.
Thank you, Neil. Scott?
Well, I think next year is a really big year, actually. I think we've talked about the ISO GA, but we've talked about COP26, and Neil's just mentioned it. I'd like to be looking back and saying we were on the stage at COP26 alongside other global bodies, recognizing the value and the power of consensus to support a post-COVID recovery, to support Build Back Better, to address the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's not for us, we have to be slightly modest about what we do. What we do is accelerate others to achieve innovation, to deliver something. Without us, they may get there, but with us, they will definitely get there faster and more effectively. So being able to communicate our message, to look back on 2021 and say we supported the globe to come out of COVID. We were on the stage in COP26. We had a very successful unifying and uniting ISO General Assembly of the members in September 2021. And we were beginning to see in the UK a reach out to a bigger audience to communicate the value of what we do. That would be really exciting.
Thank you, Scott. And Sergio?
Well, I would love to have physical meetings and to be able to see you in a face-to-face environment. I really missed that one, and hopefully before the end of next year. That is not necessarily related to our performance or what we want to do, but this is something that I really miss. I would like to see ISO as a key player when promoted international cooperation. And I think we have fantastic opportunities next year with the GA in London and also the COP26, as mentioned by Scott. But there are so many other opportunities like the G20, and there will be a follow-up meeting in Italy. So we need to ensure that we are a key promoter of international cooperation. Yeah. Then in very concrete terms, I would like to see our processes being reviewed by the Technical Management Board to ensure that we have captured the best of this crisis in terms of opportunities. So how we can be more timely in the development of our standards. How do we ensure we have a fast track mechanism in case there is a new crisis? How do we ensure that we can have a much more effective participation, especially from developing countries? And last but not least, next year is very, very important for our organization because it's the first year where we will start implementing our next strategy. So I wish to see that by the end of 2021, we are very mature as an organization in implementing our new strategy, which is really new in terms of the measurement framework. We want to track progress. That's very, very important. And second, in having the right projects that in a rolling manner work in the implementation of the strategy to make it happen in reality.
Thank you, Sergio. We feel better already. We feel more positive already looking back on a successful 2021. Neil, Scott, Sergio, thank you so much for your contributions this afternoon. Sadly, that's all we have time for. Thank you to our speakers today and our speakers throughout the 3 days of the conference. This has been the first time that we've run our conference over several days and the first time that we've used this app and the web platform. We hope you've had a great experience and you had a fantastic 3 days. My colleagues and I are looking forward to working with all of you and our stakeholders to take forward the conversations that we've had about building back better and the world of standards, whether this is about current or new standards which can help drive the recovery on new ways of collaborating to develop standards. Do contact us. We want to hear your ideas. Thank all of you for joining us. Thank you for the awards and congratulations again to our award winners. We do hope that we'll see you virtually or in person, even better next year. But again, thank you to all of our speakers and our panelists and the exhibitors in the knowledge marketplace for their considerable contributions. We do strive to continuously improve our events, and so please do give us feedback. There's a feedback form that will be sent to you by email. And last but by no means least, I'd like to thank Stephanie Einan and Gracie Malassa and the BSI conferences and marketing teams and our technical partners from Lemon Zest and all my colleagues for the roles they played to make this event happen. The recordings will be available on the BSI website for you to see again. Please subscribe to our podcast, which you can find on BSI Education, where you can hear lots of more debate about some of these major issues. Have a great rest of your day, and we hope to see you again soon.